also was a steady point of contact for exchanges of idea. An early version of this paper, I presented it a couple of weeks ago in a workshop on anti-fragile systems, and I'm going to present this new version, which is a little bit more extended, next week. So I thought this is a good chance to put it out and see whether there are major failures in the paper. What else? Nothing. The idea of the talk is I will first try to introduce the idea of software change, or the way we understand it, and deal with the notion of software theory. So in this way I hope to cover the notion of software theory change. And the third part is actually the evolution part, so the part in which we explain the kind of operation that we look at, the formal kind of operation that we look at, to explain how a certain set of formal specification get changed into another set of specification with some specific task in mind. I will dwell on this a bit. And the idea is that what we want to do is to offer a notion of resilience for software system, which is based on an inference relation. That's somewhat unusual for the literature on software resilience. But I'll try to cover these notions if someone is not acquainted with them. So software change. The idea is that, of course, you have computational systems, and there are at least two in the literature. You find at least two sort of reasons why you want to explain how a software system changes and evolves. Namely, one is the principle of architectural degeneration, the fact that at some point your architecture might be deviating from a certain principle that you have set up for your system to satisfy. And the second one is flexibility requirement, namely the principle that at some point some modification that you didn't plan beforehand might occur or might be needed. In which case you have again to change somehow your set of specification. And what we are trying to do is to model operation of changes that satisfy a specific operation according to this description, but also that satisfy a certain notion of resilience, where by resilience one intends the maximization of functionality preservation with respect to those properties that are unrelated to change. So in other words, you have the system satisfies certain specification, at some point you need to change something, and when you change something you want all the rest to stay the same as much as possible. So there are basically these two somewhat conflicting, not formally conflicting, but conceptually conflicting notion. You have to change stuff, and you want to change in a way that doesn't destroy what else the system does. Yes?
So we can also call this locality, essentially.
I guess, yes. You can call it a fridge. No, I mean, yeah, but there is a certain literature in software requirements that calls it resilience. That's where I picked up the term. But I'm curious to know in which sense you say.
Your changes should be
isolated. The change as local as possible. Yes. In that sense, fits perfectly the idea. And so, which kind of change then are we looking at? There are so the first part of the paper, which is the part that I presented in this workshop, and you can find published if you're looking for it. We dealt with these two first changes, and very recently, I mean this week I started working on this third part, which was on the back of my mind for a while, but I hadn't dealt with previously. So the idea is that perfect changes are changes that result from new or changed requirements. So you basically add something in the easiest formulation. Corrective changes are changes that results from response to defects, possibly you find them out under testing. Then what you want to do is to remove something. That's the most basic case. And the last case, which I will mention at the end of today's talk, and I have 2 slides that are after the conclusion. So because I'm not sure about them, that's why I put them out after the conclusion. So if there is time, I can show them. The idea is that what you want to do is to reflect some change in the environment. So your system is running in some environment, the environment changes somehow, you need to reflect the change in your system, and there are various ways to look into this kind of change. So for now, let me just basically skip this and come back to this later when I can say a little bit. Okay, so this is the 3 types of change that we are looking at. And what are the kind of assumptions at the back of behind this work? The first thing that we do is to look at software change in the form of scientific theory change. And the initial claim is that at least perfective and corrective changes, and I believe also the last kind of change, namely adaptive update, can be formulated in the form of scientific theory change. So I will have to mention some references here to specify what does that mean. The second assumption is that we deal with software engineering as the building and managing of some deductive closure of basically axioms. That's the idea. And in some cases this is of course unrealistic if you're dealing with extremely large software systems, but in some most basic cases it's not that unrealistic. So the idea is that basically we deal with a set of axioms that are law-like expressions that describe specification for the system. We deal with the deductive closure of that set of expression, and we formulate change operation on that deductive closure. And of course, this means that the deductive closure might need to be very large if the system that is meant to represent is actually very large. And of course, my toy example will be very small, because it's for the purpose of understanding in this case. The third important assumption is the following. What we are dealing with is actually something that I've not found very often in the literature. So there is some literature that deals with the idea of theory change, and there is some literature that deals with notion of theory change when theory is meant to represent some software system, but they usually try to abstract from the implementation. What we do is actually comparing the implementation with the specification and try to find out the case where it is in the implementation that you find violation of the specification. And from there I try to abstract again some set of specification that you can compare with the original one. But again, I will say few things on this later on. So these are the assumptions, the basis of the work. What is the background literature? Well, the kind of formal operation we are looking at is known as Algeron-Yerden von Mackinson belief revision operation. So these were initially meant to formalize change of beliefs, where beliefs are represented as propositional sets of propositions. And there is a rather large literature that deal with this in various formats. There are a number of fixed operations that are known in this paradigm, and then this has been extended in various directions. One standard direction is the preference change or preferential changes that we also consider. But for those of you who are more interested in this literature, this is where we start from. And there is a lot of literature, especially in doxastic logic and epistemic logic, that deal with this.
What do they beliefs? How do they represent beliefs?
Proposition, just sets of propositions.
Propositions. And what in particular? Some kind of logic, proposition logic.
As I said, most cases you have classic logic extended possibly with doxastic or epistemic operators. So basically model logic. That's most cases is some form of propositional logic with operations in the form of modalities.
And is time useful or not? Temporal logic?
Let me think. Top of my mind, there is nothing that deals with temporal constructions. The usual assumption is that, for example, in the case of certain operation, the operation, of course, are meant to come in some order, even if that order is not represented explicitly in the language. But one standard assumption is that, for example, most recent information is considered most relevant. So, for the case of update, for example, you deal with incoming information and you can abstract on some properties by saying, oh, and the latest information is always the most important or the most relevant. So you have to revise with respect to that information. But to be honest, I don't remember of AGM model that deals explicitly with time. I have to check that.
I can think of a very nice temporal property. Eventually, the implementation will become faithful to the specification.
No, but I think, I'm not talking about actual time, but sort of this kind of, temporal, eventually, these sorts of things.
Well, of course, because you have model extension, you can very easily translate that. Okay, so, and just to be clear, it is not the first time that AGM has been linked to some software evolution. I've found at least two earlier references. One is quite old, but it deals with the idea that yes, software requirements evolution could be formalized in terms of belief revision operations, but there's a quite long paper that doesn't deal with the formalities of this. So it's kind of the idea was there at some point, but not that it was really developed. And more recent papers deal with the case of propagation, which means you have a software model and you change something, so what you are interested then in looking at is how that changes induces other change in future state, in the state of the systems. So this is slightly different than what we do. And there are other two areas that I should mention because they are interesting with respect to the work we are doing. The idea that software can be dealt with as a theory has been in the literature and philosophy of computer science for a long time. Like from the end of the 70s, there was already the idea that software system can be represented as theory, scientific theories. And the other thing is that there has been recently work in the area of comparing software testing with the testing of scientific hypotheses. This is another area of philosophy of computer science that kind of is inspiring to look at for kind of formal work that we are doing. So this is to give you just an overview of the kind of intersection of formal and more conceptual work that is behind this research. So let me deal a little bit with the notion of software theory. What we do is we represent a software model, as I mentioned already, as the set of law-like expressions that formulate requirements of valid input states and the result of some program action into output state. I'm not going into the specific of how the syntax of this could be done because we will basically deal with propositional formulas that are meant to represent this, and the internal form of this is sort of irrelevant to the operation that we are formally dealing with. But imagine this as, say, each of the formulas describes an input state, a program action, and an output state. And we represent this with this notation, math called SM, and we will deal in terms of informal requirements. Formal requirements, program operation, and output states. There are not, of course, there are two then properties that one usually looks at. One is safety, namely when you know all that all the preconditions, all the known preconditions guarantee program execution. That's safety. On the other hand, you have completeness when you also know all the preconditions that will lead to failure. So this is, I'm putting this here because this is the reason why we talk about resilient incomplete specification. So we are dealing with the case where we actually don't know that some in the initial model some initial state of the system might lead to failure. That's why we eventually want to change some stuff, because we run into the problem once the system is implemented in some language. So this is the model, the set of specification. On the other hand, we deal with the implementation. So we look at an implementation of SM, and there are some abstractions that we need to do in this case. The first abstraction is that we want the implementation to be, to some degree, faithful with respect to the model. In other words, we don't want to compare an implementation that has nothing to do with the set of specification that we were dealing with. We assume that there is a large overlapping of what the implementation does with what the model meant the system to do. And of course some things do not overlap. And the second assumption is that what we want to then assume is that there is some extraction of the set of specification from this implementation. I have, next slide, I have a graph, a picture that should make this clear. The idea is you have this model, you look at the implementation, then you look at the implementation and try to abstract what the specification are of that implementation that are actually satisfied, and then you compare the two models. In other words, math call SI diverges from the initial model for some execution of the program, and then you can compare this with this to obtain another model that is more faithful to your initial intention.
So you use big letters, means they are sets?
This would be sets of formulas.
And so are they, for SI, is it a subset of SM, or is it?
Say it again?
Is it SI? Is it a subset?
It's a proper subset of SM. Yes. Okay. And so what we are looking at is a mapping between SM and this as prime M. So let me show you this that should make things a little bit more clear. So we start on the top left corner where we have a set of formulas, and then we look at some implementation of it. This implementation is meant to be as faithful as possible to SM, and then we abstract from this implementation some new sets of formula that are the specification that the implementation actually satisfies. And what we discover is that there is some divergence between these two sets of formula, and we want to perform some operation on this set of formula in order to obtain another set of formula that represents the evolved model of the system specification. What we are looking at is basically this set of operation, which now I will have to introduce a little bit more formally. So if this picture is sort of clear.
So yeah. SI could be a subset of SM, you're saying it's a proper subset, so then S prime M is, what is it, but this is no longer a subset of SM?
Not necessarily, it might be, at least in one case, might be an expansion of, so in at least one case, SM might be a subset of S prime M.
So SM is changed to meet the more realistic situation, but how about I? Does I change in any way?
I will be changed when I re-implement S prime. It expands the. Yes, was there someone?
Yeah, it's just a it's a bit like re-engineering, isn't it? Like you kind of re-engineer the specification from the actual implementation, and then you see what.
So, and this is what I mentioned. This bit is missing some words. Even when they were looking at software evolution to have to do with belief revision, it was never done out of this bit. It was always done, okay, you have some specification and you want to change the specification, then you expand it or you contract it. But there is some more realistic version of this, which I believe is this picture.
So this would imply it's easier to abstract from the implementation than it is to check the implementation's consistency with the original specification.
We are even assuming that this is possibly done automatically. So I don't care. Honestly, I don't care how this is done, in the sense that I don't know how to do that.
Do you actually need SM? I mean,
this one?
Yeah.
Well, if I'm assuming that I have some idea of what I want my system to do, in order to have to compare then the implementation with it, I need this.
Another question, isn't this view a little, or not a little, totally implementation-centric? So, you look at the implementation as the real thing.
Yes, but always with comparing it with what I want the implementation to do. Otherwise, if that will not be the case, I would always accept what the implementation does, as in a sense it's always correct what the implementation does. It doesn't, it becomes is real, exactly. It becomes incorrect when I compare it to my intended behavior of the system. So that's what I'm saying. That's why I need this SM, because I need something to compare it to.
But it's just that, so if the implementation has a horrible bug in it, then maybe this feedback can be not useful to the specification.
I don't understand it.
So in the sense that from the current implementation, so you have a specification implementation, you abstract the implementation, and then you are going to revise, to review the specification based on feedback from the implementation via this abstraction, via this design.
Yes.
But if the implementation contains a horrible bug, then maybe this feedback is doing more harm.
If the implementation has an horrible bug that I have first not accounted for in here, and I'm not able to recognize that SI models some phi I that was not meant to be modeled in SM, then yes, the bug will propagate. But if I have a bug in here that is formulated as some valid formula in SI, and I'm also able to show that SI models phi I, some formula, and SM does not model as phi I, then I have this, and then I have to account for it. Then I have to do something, either validate phi I or remove phi I from the...
So I have both options, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So is SI like the implemented model, plus minus errors, and therefore SM becomes the modified implemented accounting for errors?
Yes, so, yeah, exactly. So S prime M will be the modified set of specification from SI.
Yeah, because of the taking into account errors and then modifying.
So under what circumstances does the implementation come about? I mean, in the sense, can you start from the specifications, and, if it's a set of universally quantified first-order logic statements, then, instantiation of those will give you presumably some sort of implementation. I mean, can you go that way? Is that something? I was trying to think of the real world.
I'll show you an example now. It's a toy example by definition. So, but maybe if I show you that, some of the questionnaire will also be. Okay, so this is some formalities. We express the language of SM as a finite set of formula, and this will be now this LSM. So there is some notation you have to pay attention to. Some LSM, L math call SM will become SM without the math call, but you should see that at some point. So here is my example. This is my specification, math call SM. Enter an array as input, read the elements in the array starting by counting the entry at position 0. For each element with value greater than 0, add 1 to the count, return the count and stop. Okay, this is my informal sets of expression that give an intuitive meaning to my specification. Okay? Now, what I want to do is to implement this. So what I do is, okay, so this should, sorry, there is a swap in this slides. This is my SM, which is now the language of math call SM. So it's the deductive closure of set of formula that are satisfied by the language. So this slides should come right after this, but I have swapped them. Okay, sorry. And so the consequence relation of this language has some standard properties, but it's a weaker consequence relation than it usually meant to be. For example, we don't need to assume completeness or compactness. And we can assume completeness if we assume that the sets of formulas in the language is always finite. In other words, if we assume that our system can at most satisfy a finite number of specifications. If that is clear as an idea.
So compactness and completeness is this infiniteness, is a finiteness, yeah?
Well, finite, the sets of formula in the model is always finite. I always deal with finite sets of formula. The question is whether your language is also finite. If your language is also finite, it means you can express a finite number of things. In which case, you can always say the things that your system does and the things that your system doesn't do. But if the possible number of things that your system can do is infinite, you will not be able to list all the things that your system doesn't do. But the minimum requirements is that the model is somewhat consistent, that is closed under modus ponens, and it doesn't satisfy contradictions. That's the basic requirement. It's slightly weaker than any standard classical logic consequence relation. That's the idea. And then there is the implementation, right? So the language is some proper subset of the language of the model, and it is, again, we consider the deductive closure of the language of the implementation, and here is the point. We have some formula phi I that is satisfied by the implementation, and phi I is either not satisfied by the model, or the model satisfies its negation. So there are basically the two cases. Either your initial model was supposed to satisfy something that your implementation doesn't satisfy, or your implementation satisfies something while your model was supposed to satisfy the contradictory formula. That's the way we deal with the case of error in the implementation.
So we put parentheses there around the or how do we?
Yeah, sorry. So
okay.
S models phi I and
okay.
Here and here, yes. But in fact, that's not a formula of the language, right?
Yeah, I know.
Okay, so let me show you. So now the toy example. That's where the toy example should have been. You have this informal algorithm that you ask your students to implement. Actually, this is real case from our students. Yeah. So you tell them do this, right? And you ask them implement this in Java. And actually, no, you tell them this, and then you show them an implementation in Java of this algorithm, and you show them this. Okay. I'll tell you. This, right? So this will count also instances of number 0 in the array, while the algorithm was supposed to count all the positive numbers greater than 0. This will count 0, or will include 0 in the counter. So what you get is that if you run this on, say, the array that contains 0, 1, 2, you expect to get 2, but you get 3 as a result, because it counts also 0, right? And that's where the implementation doesn't match any longer the model that you had in mind. And now you want to change the new specification that is abstracted and extracted from this in order to match your actual intended specification. So this is now SI, math call SI, is enter an array as input, read the elements in the array starting by counting the entry at position 0, this match with SM. For each element with value greater than or equal to 0, add it to the count. So this is the predicate that is satisfied by SI but was not satisfied by SM. In this case, the obvious thing that we want to do, well, depends. You might decide, oh, okay, actually this is what I wanted to do. Then what you need to do is to expand XM as to include this predicate. Or you might say, no, this does something more than I meant to. I want to remove this predicate. And in one case you will expand SI as to include this, and in another case you will remove this. So these are the two operations that we are looking at. Okay, so how do we resolve the divergence? As I mentioned, there are these basic two cases. The perfective change, we change the model so that the current input in the implementation becomes valid, and SM is actually expanded as to include the formula phi I. This satisfies some requirement in completeness notion. The second case is the corrective change. We remove the specification so that this SM is contracted as to remove not phi I. This is inconsistency handling. And the last case is slightly more complex because it doesn't deal only with adding and removing formulas, but has to do with reaccommodating the specification in a way that reflects some change in the environment. So let me skip this for now, and I will come back to this towards the end also, because this is the least formally clear part. So expansion, we want to add something. The idea is we want to formulate a new S prime M, which is basically Sm plus some Fi, and this is simply the logical closure of Sm and Phi I. So we take the consequent set of the language of Sm union the singleton set that contains Phi, and of course all the consequences of Phi become in there. Notice that this can also be considered as the definition of Sm, is a way to create Sm out of an empty set of specification. You simply start by adding valid formula to the premise set. So expansion is rather trivial. Contraction is less trivial. So what you want to do is to remove some formula, and in fact this becomes a mapping from Sm to a new language, L prime, that maps into S prime M, and the idea is that the sets of formula Sm and Phi I maps to Sm minus Phi I. And here in this case, we look at the set of all complete theories that do not imply Phi I, and therefore do not imply all the consequences of Phi I. Okay, so far it's kind of just mimicking the operation that exists already. But there is one point. In this way, we don't address yet at all the issue of residuum. So how do we make sure that when we remove Phi I, we don't remove other operations that might be relevant to our system? So what we do is to define an ordering among the formulas. This ordering is this relation, and the intuitive meaning of the relation is that Phi I is at least as embedded, Phi j is at least as embedded as Phi I into the system as far as the functionality of the system are concerned. And this means that if you have to remove something, you want to start removing from the end of this relation. Simply because, for example, just look at the anti-dominance relation, you will see that any consequence relation implies the ordering in the other direction. So basically everything that as consequence is more embedded into the system, which means if you remove it, you will remove everything that goes after it. So there are some properties in here. The crucial idea is that your specification is not just a set of formula whatsoever, but it's a set of formula that is ordered in a way that reflects the importance of certain properties for the system. And now that those properties are actually relevant for your system. So what you then want to do is to define a notion of contraction that takes into account this ordering. And this is what we do. So this is the definition of safe contraction. Its original formulation was already in a paper by Alturon and Mackinson in 1985. So what we do is we take this SI, math called SI, which, SI, not standard, which is an implementation of the model. And all the formulas in this SI have a non-circular relation. So all these formula are listed in some order. And Phi I is the property that we want to eliminate from the model. So there is some operation of contraction that we want to perform with respect to this Phi I. Then what we can say is